Welcome to Perspectives Interviews, which accompanies the Perspectives Journal. I'm Matthew Andrews. I'm the Secretary and Registrar at the University of Gloucestershire, and I also have the pleasure to be the Chair of the Perspectives Editorial Board. Perspectives is a journal which focuses on the higher education sector in the UK, but also internationally, and which looks at that intersection between professional and academic practices. So it's a journal which has an academic intent, but largely written by practitioners, focusing on making sure that we have articles and content that are of real practical value and use for those people who work in the sector today. Today, I'm pleased to speak to Jon Rainford, who is the author of Widening Participation Outreach Online, Challenge or Opportunity. And this has proved to be one of our most popular articles from the last year. Good morning, Jon. Thank you for giving us some of your time for this interview. Really good to speak with you. And I very much enjoyed your article. I thought it was a great read. So thank you for producing it. I just wondered if you could start by talking a little bit about your article. What was it about?
Yeah, thanks. So my article was essentially about this idea of widening participation outreach online around March last year, in fact, when the pandemic happened. I was working at the time in quite a unique position in that I was working at the University of Bedfordshire in a digital learning team. But my background is in widening participation. So those two skill sets together at the time of the pandemic were a bit like gold dust, really. And people kept asking me, how can we do this? How can we carry on doing all this good WP work we do in an online environment? And I was asked very early on during the pandemic to give a keynote at the Neon Symposium on this particular topic. And it resonated so much with the people that were there. I thought actually it would be really useful to have it as an article somewhere so that people could refer to it throughout the year, but also ongoing when people start to evaluate this sort of work, because I think you do sometimes need something to hook into in terms of an academic article as you move forward. So really the article was kind of pulling together my thoughts on how we can do widening participation outreach online, but how we can do it in an ethical way, a sensible way, and a way that actually stops and thinks about what we're doing rather than being very reactive. And I think this is one of the problems with the higher education sector is we're very good at being reactive and finding solutions very quickly, very innovatively, but often we don't stop and think about why we're doing those things. And I think, that was kind of really the underpinning thing about this article, was actually getting people to stop and take that reflection before we did something that actually didn't solve a problem and just was busy work in effect, which no one needed in the early pandemic, did they? More busy work? Absolutely
not. I think we were all more than busy enough. I mean, in my experience, widening participation activities, certainly in the past, those pre-entry ones, relied really heavily on the benefits of in-person approaches. So, I mean, I must imagine that for people working in that particular area, the pandemic must have caused quite a lot of anxiety about how they were going to replicate those sorts of activities online. I mean, was that your experience?
Absolutely. And I think it's really interesting. I've had lots of conversation with practitioners over the last 18 months. And, I think it's safe to say that widening participation is what we call a contact sport. That face-to-face interaction can make the difference in changing someone's thoughts about university or whether they should go or those sorts of things. And a lot of the people we employ to do widening participation in the sector are the sort of people that have those skill sets, the ability to engage an audience in a lecture theatre or in a classroom. And it's a very different skill set to engaging people online. And I think that was one of the biggest trepidations, is a lot of these people, it's almost like trying to put a stand-up comedian behind a computer and saying, do your 1 hour set on a computer. It doesn't land the same because you haven't got that audience feedback, you haven't got that energy from them. So, I think this is one of the biggest challenges people had, was to think about how to make this work, but also to see the positives that were available there. We know from working in higher education that one of the biggest barriers to getting students onto campus is the cost of buses, and schools can't afford buses and they always want us to use our budget to pay for buses. But actually going online gave us a chance to reach people that didn't need to get a bus, and I think there was, in the back of my mind, I could see the real potential here that we could have a positive impact in a different way in widening participation. And a lot of it for me was about getting people to actually see those things rather than panic about what was lost, think about what could be, which I think is always really, really important. So people don't just go, well, we can't do it because we haven't got access to bring them onto campus. We might as well not try. Actually, where can we find something that may be different, but maybe better?
Yeah.
You know, and I think off the back of that, one of the biggest bugbears in my mind is the number of times in widening participation, we sit 200 students in a lecture theatre to tell them about student finance for about the 4th time that year. You know, actually there's opportunities with online that you can take some of that stuff and make the time where you do have them back on campus when we get to that point more effective, because we're not giving a didactic lecture on student finance, for example, for a 1/6 of your day that you've got them on campus.
Yeah, and your paper is certainly quite notable about the positive, quite optimistic approach it takes to certainly the future of aspects of online outreach provision. I'm going to come back on those, but one of the things I wanted to go to next is about the framework you used in your paper. Because you write about the required change in delivery mode needing consideration of 3 distinct dimensions. You talk about pedagogy, technology, and the humanistic angle. So why did you think that 3-dimensional framework was needed?
That's a really good question. I think one of the main reasons for thinking about things as a dimensional framework was from my experience of working with academics, teaching them, or supporting them to take digital learning online. But the first question is what tools do we have? What gadgets can I use? What VLE is there? What responding kind of quiz tool could I use? But not very often do academics start from that question of what do I want to do? It's always what whiz-bang thing is there that I can incorporate into my teaching. And especially in the early pandemic, I was very mindful that a lot of ed tech providers in particular would be targeting WP and those sorts of things with, look at this tool you can use. And I think it's really dangerous in some ways to start from the position of a tool, because then everything, it's that old adage, isn't it? If you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Mm. And I kind of wanted to get people to think about actually what was the thing they were trying to do, which is why why the pedagogical element is so central there. Mm. And I think, there is a difference between teaching in HE and WP, in that a lot of people that teach in HE do have some kind of pedagogical training. In terms of widening participation practitioners, the picture is more patchy. There are some practitioners that come from teaching backgrounds or have HEA fellowships, all sorts of things like that. But there's a large proportion of the WP workforce that have no training in pedagogy. So a lot of what they do is facilitation and training focused without thinking about the why sometimes. And I really wanted to kind of, again, use this opportunity of the pandemic to actually get people to stop and think about why, because I think when we think about widening participation policy and how we work in universities, quite often it's all about bums on seats, more numbers, hit the metrics, and there isn't that time to stop and think. And actually, I thought by putting pedagogy really central to this model, it would actually get people to stop and think, do I know something about pedagogy? Am I taking a pedagogical approach? Or maybe is this a chance for me to think about how I could use pedagogy in my WP, for example? And then I suppose the third dimension was probably more there for senior management in my mind than it was the practitioners on the ground. And I think we can often, in higher education, when we are in kind of a very metric focused environment, a very target focused environment, forget about the people that do this work and how emotionally draining some of this work can be, especially working with the communities we do. Especially in a pandemic where some of these communities were increasingly exposed to a lot of the challenges. Some of this work is very, very draining, but not just that kind of draining emotional interaction with the young people, for example, but the emotional kind of drain of teaching online, talking at a computer where you've got no feedback. And I think it's very easy to see blocks of time, isn't it, in someone's time workload management, saying, well, you've got this number of usable workload, let's do this, without thinking we need to build in the space for people to kind of decompress, to reflect, so they can do really good work. And I think, to me, that was really important, not just for this online outreach, but actually to get people that are reading the article to stop and think, do we allow suitable time for reflection in this work? Do we think about these things, or do we just do more? Because doing more is often not effective. And I thought this was a really good point to kind of hook that into to actually get people to think about these hard questions that we often forget to think about because we're too busy doing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And busyness can be, I think, a problem for so many roles in higher education. That pedagogical dimension, and you were touching on this earlier. I mean, one of the things you do in your paper is actually start by making quite a strong case for the benefits of online delivery. What do you think are those strengths? You started to tell us about them earlier, but do you want to just sort of pull them out a little bit more for us? The real strengths of online delivery as a mode for outreach activity.
Yeah, so I think there are so many strengths if it's done well. One of the ones that always sits in my mind is how we know in higher education there is a whole multitude of offerings of different subjects that young people will have never experienced. But with the pragmatic realities of widening participation, you can't do an outreach day on social anthropology, for example, because finding 30 students who want to do social anthropology is a big challenge in itself. But actually what we have with online delivery is we have a way that we can do generic stuff with a cohort of students and then signpost them to stuff that's more bespoke to their actual interests. So we can introduce a group of, year 12 A-level students, for example, to all these subjects that they might not be able to encounter if they came onto campus, where you have to do something that's quite narrowly focused so you can get an academic in front of them, or you can give them a specific tour of a specific part of the university. Whereas I think online, we have this real ability to curate resources together that help students explore different needs, and also that help them kind of take that initiative. So we can handhold them through, here's where you can find some online resources. Here's where you can find a, massive open online course that might be of interest to support your learning. We're going to lead you to it, but then the student can take that independent step of doing the next part. And I think that's one of the real pedagogical benefits for me of online, is we have this ability to work with a much more diverse group of learners and actually kind of help signpost them in the right directions. I think that's a real benefit. I also think the other benefit is the ability to use the online tools, digital tools, to help students record their journeys, to help students engage with those journeys as well. I mean, a lot of widening participation practitioners will tell you they prefer online delivery because it's easier to see the students engaging when they're sitting in a room. I would argue that it's easier to see that the students are in the room and awake. What we can do online with quizzes and tools is actually measure that engagement, see if that knowledge they're doing is going in, see if they're being able to reflect upon the things we're hoping to kind of impart. Can they keep a journal of the ways their learning is changing or the skills are changing? And I think there's some real kind of pedagogical benefits to this that you just can't do in a classroom where you've got 30 students and one person delivering at the front sometimes. Now, obviously, there's challenges with that, training people to use the software, giving people the time and space to plan these activities is obviously a big challenge. But I do think the pedagogical benefits are there.
Great, thank you. Thinking of challenges, I think perhaps unlike the pedagogical section, in the technological section, you perhaps highlight some of the challenges a bit more, including things like technological inequality, perhaps particularly affecting the groups that we most traditionally target for outreach activity, of course. Do you want to just talk to us a little bit about what you see as those difficulties with the use of technology, technological inequality, and how they particularly affect outreach work?
Yes, so I mean, if we talk about digital poverty and technological inequality, there are stark differences on who has access to good broadband, who has access to devices to access online learning, and this is well documented in various different places now. But I think there's also differences in what devices people are accessing the internet on. We know in a lot of kind of the groups we work with, the students have their only form of internet access via a phone. And I think, this is a real challenge. I think it's as much the challenge of, accessing our systems that we use in universities versus kind of creating systems they can access on their phone. And I think this is one of the conversations that I was hearing a lot at the beginning of the pandemic was, well, they don't have a desktop computer or they don't have a laptop computer, so they can't access this. Rather than thinking, okay, what technology do they have? what can we build so they can access it? So if they're accessing on a phone, is there a way we can deliver that material that will work on a phone? Or moreover that, why we have to do everything in a synchronous digital online mode. So obviously the default, for a lot of people is to go on Zoom or go on Teams and do something like we're doing now, having a conversation. But actually, there are other ways of doing these things, especially, where people do have limited internet access. They have one computer or one device in a household. When we were all homeschooling, there might be 3 or 4 children using one device. So could we do things asynchronously so they can access them when they do have access to their device? Or more importantly, does it all need to be done online? And I think this is one of the things that I think I didn't quite make quite as clear in the article, but it's certainly my thinking has gone forward with this, is, how we can use the online environment to facilitate an activity that can be done offline. So not everything has to be internet based, for example. It might be something you do in the real world with the resources you have around you, maybe uploading a photograph or uploading some kind of output later on, but actually taking them away from the screens. And I think that's certainly something that I think, going forward, especially, we should think about.
Yeah. Great. The third section then, and I think picks up perhaps on some of the human themes as well. And I mean, you were talking to us earlier about the importance of the sort of the human aspect of this not being forgotten. That section did raise some very important points, and I was left wanting a little more, to be honest. So some of them, particularly around, say, the issues of safeguarding, which strikes me as really important with some of those age groups that outreach work might impact. So I mean, it's a slightly different question on this one. I just wondered if you had another paper planned, because I felt that there was a whole paper just about the human element of what we're talking about here, in some of the policies and procedures and approaches and things that might need to be considered.
Yeah, I think it's a really difficult question when we think about safeguarding, and it's evolving all the time. And I certainly think so. During the pandemic, with Neon, I've run 3 training courses supporting practitioners to take their outreach online. And through each iteration of this course, we've found new advice on safeguarding. The NSPCC have updated what they do. Universities have updated their policy, and it seems to be a moving beast. But I do think there are some serious questions, which obviously I raise in the paper, about what we're asking people to sign up to when we ask them to use our platforms. And we see this in HE as well, but Zoom, for example, we're asking people to agree to a privacy statement that I can guarantee no one will have read, that tells you all sorts of things they can do with your data that it's fine for me to consent to, but should we be asking people we work with in marginalized communities to consent to that use of their data if they don't understand or know what people are doing with that data? And I think this is a very live debate. Certainly there's a lot of social workers who have been debating whether we should even be using Zoom at all. But I think sometimes these are things that don't come into our consciousness because we Zoom, especially the pandemic, Zoom became a verb, didn't it, almost? Mm-hmm. So, getting people to think about those things is really important. But I also think schools' positions on this have changed during the pandemic. I think people were very resistant early on when I wrote that article to, students signing up to things, doing things that weren't school mediated. And I think that's probably changed a little bit over time, and I think it will change even more. But I think it's really interesting that a lot of our safeguarding policies don't look at online safeguarding, or certainly didn't at the beginning of the pandemic. I think they might do now. But even, a lot of the questions, I think, you don't know about these issues until you think about them. And one of the biggest ones for me is seeing into other people's homes. I'm quite happy for you to see into my home here. It's fine. I'm in an office. It's relatively kind of, clean and tidy, so to speak. But a lot of people that are living in 1-bedroom flats or studio apartments with multiple families, do they want people seeing into their houses? So, these ideas of everyone should have their camera on. I think we need to critique and think about these things. A lot of what we do with online work in HE as well, I think is sometimes for the comfort of the person delivering rather than the benefit of the people accessing those engagements. So I think you're right, there's probably a lot more work to be done here. I think part of what I wanted to do in that paper was to get people to start thinking about these really difficult questions that you don't think about if you have your own study at home where it's nice and quiet and, you know, relatively like an office, whereas a lot of people that are accessing this provision aren't coming from that. And I think it was really important for me to get people to stop and potentially think about these things that they'd never thought about.
Well, let's get back to the paper you have written. There's always more work to be done, and I would look forward to reading that article as well. The focus of the paper that was published in Perspectives was very much about that rapid transition to online delivery and factors that should be taken into account. But I'd like to hear a little more from you now about what direction do you see online outreach taking in the coming months and indeed years? In your paper, you did write that we should become excited about the potential it may offer. So do you think the pandemic has introduced any permanent changes for the way in which we undertake outreach activity?
I think this is a really difficult question. I know what I'd like to answer, and there's a reality as well. And I think one of the problems is this kind of situation we've been in for the last 18 months, I don't think we're near the end of, and I don't think a lot of people feel like that. I think people are craving that human contact. So there's a lot of universities that have been very quick to go back to whatever face-to-face they can do because that's what they know, that's what they like doing. And I totally get that. But I think it's got to be careful that people don't do that, losing what we've benefited from for the last year. So I certainly think going forward, the landscape is going to be blended. I do think we need to have those on-campus interactions. I think they're really important. I think those face-to-face interactions are really important. But I also think there's kind of elements that we need to keep. You know, I mentioned very near the beginning, this idea of student finance talks. I really think we waste a lot of time and energy and money in the sector by repeating the same kind of generic talks with groups of students that come on campus. And yes, it's lovely for them to see a lecture theatre and sit in a lecture theatre and know what that's like. But do we need to do that delivering some generic material that probably could be delivered better and more effectively somewhere else? You know, if you could have one version of the truth that comes from student finance, for example, that's engaging, that could be used by all universities, I think we could free up a lot of resources. And I think we need to think about that, of how we can use them collectively as a sector to do stuff better and to avoid that repetition, to give more opportunities for young people to engage with stuff that's really exciting. You know, I don't think anyone would claim a student finance talk is exciting, but it's necessary, I think. I think one of the things the pandemic's also allowed us to do is to think a bit more collaboratively. And I really do hope this is one of the things that sticks with the sector going forward when we go into a blended approach. You know, we know not all universities can offer all subjects, but we also know we work in a marketized environment. So there's always a tension there. But I think it's right for young people, if they're interested in a subject, to be signposted towards something that can help them get inspired and passionate about that subject. So, you know, really taking this blended learning approach forward, of maybe we can do things on campus with our local students, but then signpost them to online activities where they can follow up those interests and passions. And that's what I'd really like to see the landscape doing. There's a website called Uni for Me, for example, which has a whole bank of resources that have been created over the last year that universities can access and signpost students towards. And I really do hope going forward, this is going to be part of the landscape. You know, people working together to do widening participation in a way that we haven't done so much before, because we are quite locally focused, especially when we think about face-to-face work. And I think that's something that I really do think that, you know, the sector should be taking forward. I do think, obviously, you know, I say this within a marketized environment where universities are concerned with getting bums on seats in their university. You know, that's a reality. But actually, there are some options here of working with the best of both worlds there, I think.
Yeah, thank you for that. Uni for Me, I've made a note of that. I'll go and make sure that, we're making best use of that here as well. So in summary, when people are reading your article, what do you hope, perhaps just briefly, the really main important points they take away?
So I hope the main thing they take away really is stopping and thinking. That's the most important thing to me. And I think stopping and thinking about why we're doing what we're doing. It's very easy to go, okay, we do this thing face-to-face, we need to find an online version. So how can we turn this face-to-face event we do into an online version, which often defaults to let's make it recorded on Zoom and broadcast out. But actually, I'm hoping people read the article and think in a slightly different way of actually what were we trying to achieve with this engagement, and how might we do it more effectively using technology so it has a better impact. And I think that's one of the things really people need to think about with widening participation, is not just doing more of the same old, because we'll have the same results. Actually, how can we use these new technologies or these opportunities that have been open to us to have more impact, to reach a wider group of students who have never, come onto our campus, who may never be able to go onto a campus because they live so remotely that that journey is just not feasible. And really getting them to think about not just the students and the young people and the mature students that engage with this widening participation work, but the staff that work in widening participation, and actually what they need to do this work effectively, what support they might need, but also what time they might need. And I hope that people reading the article will actually be thinking not in terms of how many more interventions can we do, but how more effective can we make those interventions we do so it has the best impact on our kind of targets.
Thank you, John. And thank you for your patience throughout all of these questions. It's a slightly different one now. Finally, it would be interesting to know how you got involved in writing for Perspectives.
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question, actually. This is my third paper in Perspectives, I think. The first one I wrote back in 2016 for a call for papers for an access special issue in 2016. And before then, I'd never heard of Perspectives. I was working widening participation. I didn't even know who the AUA were. And I obviously was doing a PhD looking at access. So I thought, well, this is a good place to put a paper. And I think the support I had from the editor at the time and the journal and the reviewers was so positive and really shaped the paper into something that I'm very, very proud of, that was early at the start of my PhD, but also it reached a huge audience in terms of not just academics, but practitioners, exactly where I wanted my PhD kind of work to land. And really, that's why when I came to write this paper, Perspectives was the first place I thought of, because actually the audience that read Perspectives are that kind of intersection between academics looking at higher education, practitioners, and also, as I've realized working longer in this sector, registrars, those sorts of people in universities who this work is really important to understand, but may not have the time to engage with some of the other higher education literature because they're so busy. But I certainly know, a lot of the registrars I've worked with over the years, they all seem to manage to get through Perspectives each time it comes through their door. So I think especially when you're working at this intersection of higher education policy and research, and practice, that Perspectives is an ideal place really to publish that work, for it to get seen by people that will actually take it forward in their practices and institutions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, John. I've really enjoyed this chat. Thank you for your time. Thank you for writing the article. I think it's been, real interest to me, and I'm sure it will be of use to practitioners throughout the sector. Thank you again.
Great. Thanks so much.
Thank you for watching the video, which I hope you found interesting and useful, and perhaps inspired you to find out a little bit more about Perspectives in the articles which we publish. To keep up to date on all of the articles that Perspectives publishes and the new editions, do follow us online through different social media. The one I use is Twitter, so look out for @PerspectivesHE to get the information about all the latest articles as they are released. We're also pleased to receive articles from AUA members and others working in the sector. So you can always find out more about writing for Perspectives to bring your knowledge to the benefit of the wider readership.